36 hours before the $2.4 billion satellite was scheduled to leave the launch pad, they stripped me of my flight authorization. No warning, no explanation beyond a cold directive from the new director. Turn in your access badge. They thought replacing me would be simple, but they forgot one thing in this industry: laws and technology never bow to outsiders. And I'd been preparing for this day for a very long time. My name is Elise Harrington, and for 15 years, I've been the only person at Aquila Aerospace Systems certified to pilot orbital trajectories for our billion-dollar satellites. 42 years old, 0 mission failures, the kind of record that training manuals are built around. They used to joke that I had liquid nitrogen for blood cool under pressure, precise to the microsecond, never cracking even when a solar panel deployment went sideways at T+7 minutes, and I had to recalculate our entire insertion burn on the fly. The control room at Aquila was my second home. Hell, it was more familiar than my actual apartment. I knew every flicker of every monitor, could tell you which cooling fan was acting up just by the pitch of its whine. The leather on my designated chair had molded to my shape after countless 18-hour shifts. My coffee mug chipped handle. Faded NASA logo from a conference in 2018 had a permanent spot next to Terminal 3. I'd missed my daughter's piano recitals for this job, Thanksgiving dinners, my father's 70th birthday. Each time, I told myself it was worth it because what we did here mattered. We weren't just launching hunks of metal into space. We were expanding humanity's reach, gathering data that would help predict hurricanes, track climate change, connect isolated communities to the rest of the world. Every successful launch was a victory for science, for progress, for the future my daughter would inherit. The pressure was immense. One miscalculation, one moment of inattention during a critical burn, and $2.4 billion becomes the world's most expensive debris field. Insurance companies breathing down your neck, congressional hearings, your face on every news channel as the engineer who fucked up, but I thrived on it. That knife-edge balance between triumph and catastrophe was where I felt most alive. Aquila itself was a strange beast, part cutting-edge tech company, part old boys aerospace club, part political chess game. The engineering floors hummed with the focused energy of true believers, people who dreamed in orbital mechanics and spoke in acronyms. But upstairs, in the executive suites, it was different. Up there, satellites were just expensive assets, launches were quarterly earnings events, and people like me were replaceable cogs in a machine that printed money for shareholders. I'd navigated this dual world for a decade and a half, keeping my head down, doing my job, earning respect through sheer competence. The engineers trusted me because I spoke their language and never asked them to cut corners. The executives tolerated me because I'd never given them a reason not to. My record was spotless, my reputation bulletproof, or so I thought. The Orion Apex program was supposed to be my crowning achievement, the most sophisticated weather surveillance satellite ever built, with resolution capabilities that made our previous generation look like they were shooting through frosted glass. 3 years of my life had gone into planning its orbital insertion, calculating the perfect trajectory that would maximize coverage while minimizing fuel consumption. I knew every rivet, every sensor, every line of code in that bird's guidance system. In my desk drawer, I kept a photo from the day we completed the initial systems integration. The entire team, exhausted but grinning, standing in front of Orion Apex in the clean room. We looked like proud parents. We were proud parents. This was our baby. And in 36 hours, I was supposed to guide it into the sky. The termination letter was still in my pocket as I stood in the parking lot, staring up at the launch complex in the distance. 15 years. And they'd given me less time to clear out than it takes to fuel a rocket. Victor Kane arrived at Aquila 3 months ago like a storm system nobody saw coming. Harvard MBA, 0 aerospace experience, but a reputation for streamlining operations at 3 different tech companies. The board loved him. His PowerPoints were gorgeous, full of words like synergy and optimization and lean methodology. He wore suits that cost more than my monthly mortgage and had this way of smiling that never quite reached his eyes. Our first collision happened during a routine pre-flight review. I was walking the team through the thermal protection protocols when Kane interrupted. Do we really need 17 thermal checks? Seems excessive. Each one costs us 4 hours of prep time. I kept my voice level. The thermal variance at orbital insertion can swing 300 degrees in seconds. One failed sensor that we didn't catch means the satellite's electronics fry before it completes its first orbit. But 17? He tapped his tablet like he was calculating my hourly rate. Industry standard is 12. Industry standard doesn't account for our polar trajectory. We're passing through zones of extreme. Let's compromise. 14 checks. He said it like he was being generous, like orbital physics was a negotiation. That became his pattern. Death by 1,000 cuts, each one justified by efficiency metrics and cost-benefit analyses. He reduced our simulation runs from 8 to 5, cut the recovery time between shifts from 12 hours to 8, brought in consultants who'd never worked a real launch to evaluate our process redundancies. The younger engineers started calling him the optimizer behind his back, but not in an affectionate way. Sarah Martinez, our propulsion lead, quit after Kane suggested they could monitor fuel pressure remotely from India to save on overtime. He doesn't understand, she told me, clearing out her desk. This isn't IT support. You can't outsource intuition. What bothered me most wasn't his ignorance. Plenty of executives didn't understand the technical details. It was his complete lack of curiosity. He never asked why we did things a certain way, never wanted to learn. To him, Aquila was just another company to flip, get in, cut costs, boost the quarterly numbers, collect his bonus, and move on to the next victim. I started documenting everything, every bypassed protocol, every shortened checklist, every efficiency improvement that compromised safety. My laptop at home filled with screenshots, emails, meeting recordings, call it paranoia. But I'd been in aerospace long enough to know that when things went wrong, executives like Kane had golden parachutes while engineers like me became scapegoats. The real warning sign came during a strategic planning session I wasn't supposed to be in. I'd gone back to conference room 7 to retrieve my forgotten notebook when I heard Kane's voice through the door, which hadn't latched properly. The Orion Apex launch is more strategic than scientific, he was saying. The capabilities we've built in, let's just say certain agencies are very interested in what this bird can see. Another voice, probably Davidson from the board, the State Department cleared this. They don't need to know every detail. Plausible deniability. Officially, it's a weather satellite. My blood turned to ice. I knew exactly what he meant. Orion Apex's resolution capabilities weren't just good for tracking storm systems. They could read license plates from orbit, identify individual faces in crowds, monitor military installations. If Kane had added surveillance protocols without proper authorization, he wasn't just risking the mission, he was violating international treaties. That night, I pulled up the flight plan on my secure terminal. Everything looked normal at first glance, but I knew these trajectories like my own heartbeat. There a 2-degree deviation over the Pacific, and there an unusual orbital adjustment over Eastern Europe. Tiny changes, but they'd take us over sensitive military zones in Russia and China. Using my administrative access, I dug deeper into the code repository. Buried in the guidance subroutines was a hidden script, encrypted but not invisible if you knew where to look. It would allow remote activation of the high-resolution cameras over specific coordinates, bypassing the normal approval chains. The commands could come from anywhere, untraceable, deniable. Kane wasn't just cutting corners on safety. He was turning our weather satellite into an illegal spy platform. The pieces started falling into place like debris from a failed launch. Tom Rodriguez, who'd worked European operations for 20 years, pulled me aside in the cafeteria one morning. He kept his voice low, eyes scanning for eavesdroppers. You know, Kane was at Celestial Systems in Brussels before this. Tom stirred his coffee unnecessarily. My buddy over there says he left under a cloud. Something about selling satellite time to private intelligence firms. Nothing proven. But the European Space Agency blacklisted him. Why didn't this come up in his background check? Tom shrugged. You know how it is? These guys fail upward. Plus, he probably had his records sealed with a nice fat NDA. I spent the next week conducting my own investigation, careful to use only my legitimate access. The orbital parameters kept nagging at me. Our published flight plan showed a standard sun-synchronous orbit for weather monitoring, but the fuel calculations were off by 12%. You don't load extra fuel unless you're planning maneuvers you haven't disclosed. Late one night, I accessed the payload specifications. Everything matched our official documentation: thermal imaging, atmospheric sensors, communication arrays. But there was an anomaly in the power distribution. The imaging system was drawing 40% more power than it should. That only made sense if the resolution was significantly higher than what we declared to the International Telecommunications Union. I cross-referenced the trajectory adjustments with global conflict zones. Every single deviation would position Orion Apex over a strategic military or economic target: the South China Sea during a planned naval exercise, the Persian Gulf during oil transport peaks, the Russia-Ukraine border at optimal imaging angles. My hands shook as I documented everything. Screenshots, code excerpts, trajectory calculations, all saved to an encrypted drive I kept hidden in my apartment. This wasn't just corporate malfeasance. This was potentially an act of war if the wrong country detected what we were doing. 3 days later, Kane called me into his office. He was standing at his window, looking out at the launch complex. "Elise, I need you to sign off on some modified flight parameters." He didn't turn around. "I'd need to review them first." "No need. Minor adjustments for weather avoidance." "With respect, Victor, I don't sign anything I haven't personally verified. That's been my policy for 15 years. He finally turned, and his smile was all teeth. "Policies change, companies evolve, people adapt, or they become redundant." "Is that a threat?" "It's a reality. I've already identified your replacement. Young man from SpaceX, hungry, flexible, understands that sometimes we need team players, not hall monitors." My mind raced. "He's not certified for polar orbital insertions. The Orion Apex trajectory requires—" "He'll be certified by launch." Kane waved his hand dismissively. "Amazing what you can accomplish when you remove bureaucratic obstacles." "You mean safety protocols?" "I mean obstacles." His voice turned hard. "Sign the parameters, Elise, or clean out your desk." I stood up slowly. "I'll need to think about it." "You have until tomorrow morning, 9 sharp." That night, I pulled up the certification database. Kane's replacement, Marcus Webb, had basic orbital certification, but nothing close to what Orion Apex required. Legally, he couldn't pilot this trajectory. The insurance alone would void if they found out. But I suspected Kane had a plan for that, too, probably falsified credentials or a last-minute emergency certification. I opened my secure laptop and started composing a detailed report. Every violation, every suspicious modification, every piece of evidence that Orion Apex was being weaponized, but I didn't send it, not yet. Instead, I did something else, something that would become my insurance policy. During the final simulation run scheduled for 8:30 that evening, I had one last chance to access the main systems as lead pilot. While running through the standard pre-flight checks, I inserted a small modification into the authentication protocol. Nothing that would show up in logs, nothing that would trigger security alerts, just a tiny requirement that any launch command would need to verify against my personal biometric signature. Without me, Orion Apex would be a $2.4 billion paperweight. As I finished the modification, I allowed myself a small smile. Kane thought he was playing chess while everyone else played checkers. He had no idea I'd already flipped the board. The next morning at 8:45, I walked into Kane's office with my answer. He was already sitting behind his desk, Marcus Webb beside him like an eager puppy. Webb looked about 28. All confidence and no experience. The kind of pilot who'd never had a bird die on him at T+30 seconds and had to explain to Congress why $500 million just became artificial reef. "Elise." Kane didn't offer me a seat. "Have you reconsidered?" "I have." I placed a folder on his desk. "These are my concerns about the modified parameters. The trajectory passes through 3 restricted zones. The imaging protocols violate both the Outer Space Treaty and our launch license. And Marcus here," I turned to Webb, "doesn't have the certifications required by federal law to pilot this class of orbital insertion." Webb started to speak, but Kane raised his hand. "Marcus completed his certification yesterday." A polar orbital certification requires 300 hours of simulation time and 5 supervised launches. He's had, 40 hours. "The requirements are outdated," Kane said smoothly. "We've received a waiver." From whom? Because the Federal Aviation Administration doesn't issue waivers for— Enough. Kane stood up. You're being obstructionist, rigid, unable to adapt to modern operational realities. I'm being legal. There's a difference. Not anymore. He slid a document across the desk. Your termination letter, effective immediately. Security will escort you out. I picked up the letter, scanning it quickly. Failure to adapt to new operational requirements, vague enough to avoid lawsuits, damning enough to prevent me from working in aerospace again. This is a mistake, Victor. The only mistake was keeping you around this long. He pressed his intercom. Send security to my office. I looked at Webb. You have no idea what you're stepping into. When this goes sideways, and it will, you'll be the one they blame, not him. He'll be in another job by then, maybe another country. Webb shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. 2 security guards appeared at the door. I knew them both, Stevens and Delgado. We'd shared coffee during long launch nights. Stevens couldn't meet my eyes. Gentlemen, Kane said, please escort Ms. Harrington to her office to collect her personal items, then to the gate. Ensure she doesn't access any computer terminals. As we walked through the halls I'd navigated for 15 years, I kept my face neutral. Engineers peered out of doorways, some sympathetic, some confused, all silent. Word travels fast in a place like Aquila. At my office, I packed slowly, methodically, my coffee mug, a few framed photos, a stress ball shaped like Jupiter that my daughter had given me. Stevens stood by the door while Delgado watched me pack. Elise, Delgado said quietly, this is bullshit. It's fine, I said, loud enough for the security camera to pick up. Everything's going to be fine. I left my access badges on the desk, my parking pass, my laptop. They'd already remotely wiped it anyway, but they couldn't wipe what was in my head, or what I'd already set in motion. As we reached the main gate, Stevens finally spoke. For what it's worth, everyone knows you're the only one who should be flying that bird. Maybe, I said, but apparently, I'm not the one who will be. The gate closed behind me with a metallic clang. I sat in my car for a moment. Looking back at the complex, the launch tower was visible in the distance, Orion Apex already being prepared for its journey. 36 hours from now, Kane would give the order to launch. Webb would input the commands, the systems would initialize, and then they'd discover what I'd done. I pulled out my personal phone, the one Aquila's IT department never knew about, and checked my encrypted folder. Everything was there, the evidence, the falsified certifications, the illegal surveillance protocols, but I wasn't going to release it, not yet. Because simply exposing Kane wasn't enough. He'd wiggle out of it, claim ignorance, throw Webb under the bus, and land another executive position within 6 months. No, I wanted him to feel what I felt. That moment when everything you've worked for crumbles because someone else held all the cards. I drove home and opened my laptop. The authentication protocol I'd embedded was elegant in its simplicity. It didn't prevent the launch that would be too obvious, too easily traced back to me. It simply required my biometric confirmation for any orbital adjustment commands. Without it, Orion Apex would launch, but it would be uncontrollable. A $2.4 billion bullet fired into space with no way to steer it. Kane would have approximately 18 minutes after launch to realize something was wrong. By then, it would be too late. I poured myself a Scotch 12-year-old Macallan I'd been saving for the successful launch and started composing an email I wouldn't send for another 35 hours. The authentication system I embedded was a masterpiece of subtle engineering. During that final simulation at 8:30, while Kane was probably celebrating his victory in advance, I had worked with surgical precision. Every pilot has their own style, their own rhythm of inputting commands. Mine had been recorded in the system for 15 years, a digital fingerprint more unique than DNA. I'd woven this signature into the launch authorization protocol, but not where anyone would look for it. Not in the main code, not in the security layers. I hid it in the telemetry feedback loop, that constant stream of data between the satellite and ground control. The system would accept any launch command, but when it came time for orbital adjustments, the real mission, Kane's illegal surveillance maneuvers, it would query for my specific command pattern. Without it, the satellite would default to safe mode, essentially becoming a very expensive mirror floating in space. The beauty was in the timing. The launch would proceed normally. Webb would input his commands. The rocket would ignite, and Orion Apex would rise majestically into the sky. Everyone would congratulate themselves. Kane would probably open champagne. Then, at T+18 minutes, when they tried to initiate the first orbital correction, they'd hit my wall. I spent the next 24 hours preparing my evidence package. Not just the technical violations, but the paper trail showing Kane knew exactly what he was doing. Email threads where he discussed alternative revenue streams from the satellite's capabilities, meeting notes where he mentioned interested parties in unnamed agencies, the falsified certification documents for Webb, complete with metadata showing they were created just 2 days ago. Everything went onto 3 separate encrypted drives. One stayed with me. One went into a safety deposit box at a bank Kane's people would never think to check. The third I mailed to my attorney with instructions not to open unless